Yeah, good morning, everyone. How you guys doing? My class, Dr. Jared. How you all doing? My name is Oluduro Olaiwola Gabriel, originally from Nigeria. I'm in the United States Navy, and I'm stationed on the ship, currently homeported in Guam. As you can see, I'm recording on the ship. That's so cool. But then, yeah, let's quickly go to the background of my study. It is well known that the common expression of probability have different meaning to different people, and that even quantitative expression can be interpreted differently. This difficulty is in communicating is compounded by framing the influence of decision making, the description of fact and contingency outcome. For example, McHale and others find out that patients, students, and physicians were more likely to choose surgery over radiation therapy in treating patients who have lung cancer when outcome treatment was framed as probability of surviving rather than probability of dying. In medical decision concerned with the framing have been largely confined to the description of outcomes. One aspect of framing that has not been well investigated, though, which we're going to be doing today, of different measure of risk. In clinical setting, risk may be summarized using different measures, relative risk or absolutely risk, which sometimes is called attributable risk. In underlying risk of disease is known as relative risk, which can be converted to AR. The two measures are logically equivalent, and in the sense presentation of either leads to the same decision. However, the literature of perception of risk suggests that might not be true. Now, let's go to the hypothesis of study. To evaluate this question, we conducted a questionnaire-based study to establish whether patient perception of risk were influenced by the presentation of risk in relative versus absolute term. So then we hypothesized that the patient would misinterpret relative risk and not account for underlying risk of disease when compare it to measures of absolute risk. Population of study now. Patients were recruited, from outpatient practice of academic general internal medicine group in rural New Hampshire. The group is part of the large multi-specialty practice at the time of the study, consisted of 12 internists and 4 nurse practitioners and 4 physician assistants, seeing a mix of scheduled and unscheduled working patients. So that's the population of our study. So now we're going to talk about the type of study. This is the questionnaire-based clinical study of a general medicine outpatient clinic at a rural tertiary care center associated with a medical school, I mean. So let's talk about the study sample. This test involved a total number of 470 out of 511 consecutive patients who agreed to answer a question while waiting for their clinic visit. So it's within the clinical setting. So yeah, the mean age was 49.1 years. 62.1 were female out of the total population, and 51.9 had at least 1 year of education beyond high school. Patient response to the choice of 2 equally efficacious medication for the management of hypothetical serious disease. So the benefit of one medication was stated in relative term, the other was an absolute term, indicate indifference to the choice of medication or choose not to answer. So let's talk about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. From August to September 1989, 8.5 days was spent in designated waiting room, in which scheduled and unscheduled patients who registered were asked to complete a 3-page questionnaire. Only patients who could not read English, were visually impaired, or who had physical disability that limited their ability to read or write, were actually excluded. Patients who do not provide response to the questionnaire were also eliminated because we actually want to get feedback from them. So a written informed consent was required, though a cover letter approved by IRB, which is the certifying board, before you can get information from patient. You want to talk about their PII, you don't want to put it out there, you want to make sure that you're actually approved by IRB, was attached to each questionnaire stating the intent of the study, and that no unique patient identifier will be obtained. There was no different patient characteristics among those who responded to different versions of this form. So the first was designated to test the risk presentation, in which the patient were asked to make a choice between taking 2 medications. The 2 medications were described as causing at the same almost no side effect. However, though, the benefit of medication A was presented in relative term, while the medication B was presented in absolute term. The second situation was described to test patient understanding of a relationship between relative risk and absolute risk, or attributable risk. So the patient were told there was only one medication to treat a disease, a particular disease, and its benefit was explained in relative terms and then asked to indicate this benefit in absolute terms. So let's talk about the statistical analysis method that was used in this journal. All data were entered using SAS, FSP with error trapping. So standard chi-square contingency table method was used to test the association between the categorical variable. The odd ratios, OR, with 95% confidence interval, as described by the Ulmer and Lemenshaw using parameter estimates and standard error from the appropriate logistic regression analysis, SAS PROC-Logis, was actually used in this my presentation from the journal that I'm going to be using. So let's talk about the result that was gotten by the author. Now, the authors state that when asked in the first hypothetical situation to choose a medication to treat this disease, about 56.8% of the subjects choose the medication with the benefit presented in relative terms. Now, 14.7% choose the medication with benefit presented in absolute terms. 15.5% were willing to be treated with either medication, and 13% could not decide. The result was no chance alone, as S squared equals to 254.3, with the subject in DF. So the subjects were most likely to choose the medication, whose benefit was presented in relative terms, regardless of the age, the gender, the level of education, reported health issue, experience with medical treatment for hypertension, or high serum cholesterol, or question versions. Regardless of those variables, they choose the medication that are actually presented in relative terms. So moving forward, in the second hypothetical situation in which the subject were given the underlying risk and dying benefit of medication in relative and asked to indicate absolute term, to indicate in absolute term, 28.2 correctly identified expected benefit and apparently were able to convert the relative into absolute benefit. So patients who were able to equate this relative benefit between the absolute benefit in the second situation, though, were more likely to be indifferent to choice of medication in the first situation, which is OR equals 1.84, with 95% confidence interval, However, like in other subjects, more than half of them, which is 58.1%, still prefer the medication with benefit expressed in relative terms in the first hypothetical situation. Now, let's talk about the conclusion of our article. So the conclusion of the author, So the main conclusion of the study is that the majority of the patients faced with choosing between two treatments, one expressed in terms of the relative benefit and the other in terms of absolute benefit, choose the frame in relative terms. Now, the footnote, which is my opinion on this case now. I agree with the conclusion of the author because the statistical test and the analysis were accurate based on the calculation. More so, it might be expected that the patient characteristics, especially the level of education, will be associated with the ability to equate relative benefit with the absolute benefit. The only note bias in this study in the size of the sample population. That's the only bias that I noted in this. No, not just only that. The first thing I noticed that was the size of the population, though not so small, but as a sample size of the study is obviously an important part of a good research study. Small sample size can also lead to cases of bias, such as non-response, which occur when more subjects do not have opportunity to participate in the study. Another limitation that I noticed in this study is that sequential processing was required to equate the relative benefit with the absolute benefit. It appears that a conditional frame was generated in which the underlying risk of death was eliminated from the consideration, So the majority of the patients we're talking about in this sample situation simply have to compare the relative benefit, that is, it will decrease the risk. They have that mindset that it will decrease the risk with the absolute benefit, which is like 8% death prevented per 100. So if they know that in the first situation, relative benefit is going to decrease their risk of that disease, and in the second situation, which is absolute risk, is just going to prevent 8% of per 100 that's going to actually die from the disease, their decision is kind of may be influenced in this situation. So in choosing their answer, so if the majority of the patient may simply have to compare the relative benefit that would decrease their risk with absolute benefit that is only 8% per 100 in choosing the answer, the finding of this study is applicable to patients in clinical setting though, compared to different measures of risk and investigate why majority of the patient decided to choose relative benefit as opposed to absolute benefit. So that's another limitation that I noticed that might influence their decision, you know. So in conclusion though, this study design is ideal for hypothesis and if the limitation can be corrected in future. You know, that's just the way I feel about it. If they can do something about that in the future research, they can actually make a better product, because it's a very nice study, because when you look at that, they have a good study case, and they did a very good analysis, a very good statistical analysis on it, and I go with that. But the only limitation, I mean, like the two limitation I noticed there was the size of the population and the comparison on the decision, which might influence the decision of the patient. It might not be a big deal, but at the same time, it might at some point, you know, along the line, influence their decision making, which may make them to go for the relative risk as more as compared to the absolute risk, the absolute or attributable risk. So yeah, so that's my take on this, and my reference is gotten from Malaika DJ, as you can see from the screen. And it's called the title of the article is "The Framing Effect of the Relative versus the Absolute Rate." Is from the Journal of the General Internal Medicine, and you can see all that if you pull up from the website. I mean from the journal. So yes, this has been my presentation to the class. I look forward to look at every other presentations too. It's nice talking to you, Dr. Jared. It's been a pleasure to be your student too. I've been enjoying this class a lot. I just want to quickly say this before this recorder actually times me out. It's been fun being stationed on the ship and still be able to do this online. And I've actually learned a lot from the biostatistic class and, you know, epidemiology class. So nice recording. I hope this really really helps my fellow classmates in one way or the other. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.